So let us begin. Now the next scene is when Mark gives us a sort of summary statement in the next 4 verses, 53 to 56. That is, when they crossed over, Mark will tell us what happens when they cross over. So this serves like a summary statement when they come to land at Gennesaret. As soon as they get out of the boat, the people recognize him, and Jesus, once again, the people rush to him. So they keep rushing to him in order to be healed. The rushing to Jesus is basically that they will bring their sick. We saw immediately after the feeding of the 5,000 in the Gospel of John, people want to make him king. And Jesus will not trust himself to those who only go by the external signs. Mark does not have that problem. He realizes the need of the people, and he does not show any reaction on the part of Jesus, even when the people bring the sick to him. He is a Jesus who is available. And so Mark is showing once again in this summary statement the popularity of Jesus, where whenever Jesus goes, and by adding the places like villages or cities or farms, wherever he goes, they reach out in order to be healed. And here they begged that they might even touch the fringe of his cloak. This reminds us of the woman in the crowd who said to herself that she would even touch his cloak and she would be healed. And so this, of course, Mark has corrected that understanding of the magical touch we saw in that context. And here also, he tells us that those who touched were healed, but doesn't mention very explicitly that they had faith, but very likely wants us to understand that they had faith. Mark brings us then to the discussion of clean and unclean first, and second, to the discussion of inside and outside. So in the discussion of clean and unclean, the first 13 verses of chapter 7, there is reappearance of the scribes. And notice, even though we are in the Galilee section, the scribes come from Jerusalem. We notice them in chapter 3, verse 22. The scribes who came from Jerusalem make the allegation about Beelzebul. What did these Pharisees and some of the scribes do? They gathered around him, and what did they notice? They noticed, not Jesus, because Jesus is not mentioned, that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, and Mark explains what is meant by defiled hands, that is, without washing. And because Mark seems to be writing for a Gentile community, he will explain what it means and what exactly is done by those people of that time who wanted to keep the law. So in these verses, he will explain what exactly they do and how they were. So the focus in these verses is on external cleanness. That is, making sure that there is external cleanness. So the people asked him, and the Pharisees and the scribes, they who do what they have to do, asked him, why do the disciples not follow those traditions? So basically, the tradition of the elders is the focus. Jesus, however, wants to go back to what the Torah is saying, what the books are saying, rather than the tradition. So he quotes to them Isaiah text. And in Isaiah 29:13, very clearly Isaiah stated that those who worship only with the lips are worshiping only from the outside and not from within. And so therefore, even though this is a discussion about cleanness and uncleanness, the focus is also within and without. A person can honor, a person can respect, a person can worship God only with the external. And this brings us sometimes to our own response to God, especially at those times when we were privileged to go before the Lord in the Blessed Sacrament in the church. While it is true that we must honor the Lord, we must worship the Lord externally by bowing down, etc., some take it to such an extent that they do it, it seems, more from show or for show rather than flowing from within. So each of us needs to ask ourselves whether our worship is merely external worship or internal worship. And here, Jesus speaks about how tradition and the tradition of the elders is given more importance than what God commanded. And how is this done? This is done by circumventing the law, by going around the law. What did God command them to do? God commanded in the Torah, and that's why when Moses is mentioned, that was the understanding. It was Moses who gave the law to the people from God. And that's why from when Moses said, it's not Moses who said, but actually God who said. But the understanding is that Moses is God's spokesperson. And so Moses said, honor your father and your mother. And that is the fifth commandment according to both Deuteronomy and according to Exodus. And so a person has to honor. But what do I do? Because I do not want to care for my father and mother even as they grow old. I do not want to share the property which I have earned with my hard work with my father and mother. What I do is I tell them that this house which I have, only here is where my wife, my children, and I live. The other place where you could have lived is Qurban. And Qurban basically means it is offered to God. Now, since it is offered to God, I cannot use this place, and you cannot use this place. It is God's place. So by telling the parents that it is God's place, and because it is God's place, a human cannot use it, they do not allow the son to do anything for the parents. And so this is how the word of God is circumvented. This is how tradition is given more importance than the word of God. So therefore, the focus ought not to be so much on tradition as it ought to be on law, if you want to bring the tradition and law side by side. However, if you only want to bring the law, then human need will take precedence over the law. The second part is because of the fact that Jesus had spoken about internal and external worship. Here, the crowd is now invited to listen. Even though the verse 16 is not in most texts, and that's why the NRSV has it below, and will mention F and have it below. I have put it within the text because when you look at the words, listen to me, all of you, in verse 14, then it can be very likely that Jesus would have concluded, or Mark would have concluded this particular part by this, once again, using an inclusion, let anyone with ears to hear hear. The crowd is called, and they are asked to understand. What are the crowd called to understand? That there is nothing from outside which goes into a person that makes the person unclean. Now, Mark, on the one level, Jesus was talking about external and internal in the context of worship. However, as far as Mark is concerned, he extends this now, and he says that this discussion about defiled hands becomes actually a discussion of what actually can defile, and later was used for food laws as far as Mark is concerned. It has been the case in the past that when Jesus leaves the crowd, as in the case of the parable discourse, when the parable of the sower was sown, the disciples in private ask him about the parable. Now, On the surface level, there seems to be no parable here, but verse 15 is interpreted by the disciples as a parable. And what does Jesus say in verse 15? That there is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. Now, this can be interpreted in a variety of ways. The Markan community interpreted this in two ways. That is, first, food. Anyone, therefore, can eat any kind of food. So no matter what the food is, if it goes inside you, it does not defile you because it is outside of you. So first, food laws basically became very, very broad as far as the Christian community is concerned. For us, there is no restriction to eating any kind of food. However, Mark also interpreted this as something which comes from within, that is, by mentioning later on the catalog of sins. And so they enter the house, and the house is that place where Jesus provides explanation. Just like he told them in the parable of the sower and the seed, that they did not understand the parable, how would they understand the other parables? Here also, he gets them to realize that they do not understand. And it's so clear. Now, why is it that there is nothing outside a person that can make a person unclean? Because the sins which a person commits are the sins which come from within. The stomach, that is basically the interpretation with regard to food, is basically what he would say on the surface level. But he takes that to a deeper level when he says that it is what comes from within that defiles. And there are a total of 13 vices mentioned, beginning with evil intentions. Evil intention serves as the broad context. So evil intentions is something from the heart, something from within. And then after evil intention, there are 12 sins mentioned, and these sins are in two groups of 6 each. The first will focus on specific acts, and the second are vices in abstract. So basically, it is adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, and folly. All of these are evil things, and these are what come from within, and this is what defiles. So basically, the understanding is on two levels. First, when Jesus, according to Mark, declares all foods clean, that is, there is nothing from outside that you have to regard as taboo. But on the spiritual level, it can also be interpreted as this, namely, that I do not blame the external situation for the manner in which I respond. There are times when we use a phrase like, you made me angry, or you upset me, or you made me do this, and so on. That actually is not the manner in which any adult will speak. That is not the manner in which any adult will speak. And so, basically, what is interesting to understand is that when you keep blaming the outside person, when you keep blaming the outside situation, then you are behaving like a child. Inside is what matters. So for me, when I respond rather than react, I can really respond. And therefore, basically, this is what it is. So the meaning of avarice is basically greed. So avarice means greed. Licentiousness means to be very free in the sexual aspect. That's the meaning of a licentious person, very, very free with regard to sex and so on. Okay? And we notice also that sometimes we give more importance, unfortunately, to sex than we ought to have given, because sex we must regard as something natural. When you focus too much on it, you make it so important and so not to be done and so on. That ought not to be the case. It is something which is given by God as a gift, and we must regard it, not focus too much on it, which we have done unfortunately in the past, too much on sexual sins and not enough on sins like injustice and on being rude and being angry, and those kind of sins which we have not focused on. We need to return once again to focus, especially on these communitarian sins, on lack of concern for others, on injustice, on oppression, and so on. Mark's gospel is a gospel which is open to a Gentile community. And this scene, or this particular text, which is also found, we shall see later, in Matthew chapter 15, verses 21 and 28, is where Jesus is in Gentile territory. So we read here that Jesus is in Tyre. He goes to the region of Tyre, and Tyre is often linked with Sidon. Tyre and Sidon were regarded as the bad lands, as the land of sin and so on, but very clearly Gentile territory. Even though Jesus enters a house in Matthew, notice Matthew 15, 21 to 28, Matthew has got a similar text, but Matthew will not have Jesus enter a house. We might remember that in chapter 8, there is also in Matthew chapter 8, there is the miracle of the healing of the centurion servant. And that healing, we know, is done from a distance. Jesus does not go to the centurion's house, because the Matthean Jesus never enters the house of a Gentile or a house in Gentile territory. So in Matthew, in the same scene, even though Jesus wants to escape notice, he doesn't enter a house. In Mark chapter 7, 24, Jesus enters a house. He does not want anyone to know it, because possibly he wants some peace and quiet. He wants to be alone. And so therefore, even though he wants to be alone, he cannot, because a woman comes to him. And in the beginning, even though Mark tells us that the daughter had an unclean spirit, later in chapter 7, verse 26, she begs Jesus to cure or to cast the demon out of her. So unclean spirit, demon are used interchangeably by Mark. The woman's daughter has an unclean spirit, and she came, and just like Jairus, we might remember, who also earlier had done the same, she bowed at the feet of Jesus, just like Jairus had done. So there are two characters in Mark who do that, Jairus and this Syrophoenician woman, to show this great entreaty, to show that they are serious about their plea, and also to show that they believe that Jesus can do what they are requesting. So that could also be, though Mark does not say it, he only gives us the external position of the person like Jairus and this woman, but it can be interpreted as the great entreaty when you come and bow down at somebody's feet. It can also be interpreted as your knowledge, your awareness that the person of whom you are requesting the favor can indeed grant you the favor. Mark gives us details about this woman. She was a Gentile. So very clearly, she's a Gentile. And he gives us the birth origin of the woman, that is from Syria and Phoenicia. The people in that area were called Syrophoenicians. So she's a Gentile, that means she's a non-Jew, and she begs Jesus to cast the demon out of her daughter. Now, in the Gospel of Mark, because Jesus very clearly is open to a Gentile mission, the words of Jesus, even though insulting, are not as insulting as in Matthew. In Matthew's gospel, because Jesus does not enter a house, Jesus is outside, the disciples are with him. And because the disciples are with him, and Jesus is moving, and the woman seems to be coming after him and keep on making her request, Jesus answered her not a word. Matthew says, Jesus answered her not a word. In other words, Jesus ignores her completely. It is the disciples here who act as intermediaries on the part of the woman and say, listen to what she's saying. At least tell her to go away. Do something. And then Jesus turns in Matthew with the insult. Here also, it is an insult, but not as harsh as in Matthew, as we will see in a few moments. However, the insult is the children very clearly are the chosen ones for whom Jesus is sent, and the dogs are all the outsiders. Even though some regard that when Jesus talks about dogs, he's referring to house dogs, and while there may be some truth in that because of the response of the woman and how she regards the dogs, it seems more it is the woman's intuitiveness, it is the woman's deep profundity which allows her to respond in this manner. As far as Mark is concerned, Jesus seems to want to insult the woman, that the children have to be fed first. However, when the words first are used, fed first, it means that after the children are fed, the dogs can eat. So the first feeding is for the children, and then the later feeding, if anything remains, is for the dogs. So how can the children's food, which actually belongs to the children, that is the chosen race, be thrown to the dogs, be given to outsiders first? However, the woman is very, very beautifully aware of what Jesus is saying. And here notice, the woman does not react. The woman responds. Here very clearly we can see the difference between a reaction and between a response. A reaction would have meant that the woman would sulk, that the woman would say, if you do not want to help me, then don't help me, but don't insult me. Don't talk in such derogatory terms to me. Don't call me a dog. Who do you think you are? Why do you use this term for me? This is how the woman would have reacted. The woman, however, is not a reactor. She is a responder. And notice, the reason why she is a responder is because she really, really, really is concerned about her daughter. That she will even bear the insult for the sake of her daughter. When she bowed down before Jesus, she was aware that he could do what she wanted. So she still has that belief. The word sir here in chapter 7:28 is translated in English as sir, actually ought to be translated as Lord. The woman addresses Jesus as Lord. The only time in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus is addressed as Lord. In Matthew's Gospel, Jesus is addressed as Lord often and only by believers. In Matthew's Gospel, only believers call Jesus Lord. Judas never addresses Jesus as Lord, only calls Jesus Rabbi. Here, the woman addresses Jesus, which is translated in English as Sir, but is the Greek kurios, which is Lord. And notice the woman. Not only does she not get insulted, not only does she respond, but she responds in such a manner that she says, the dogs are not eating after the children eat. The dogs are eating even as the children eat. So while the children are eating, the crumbs are falling down and the dogs are eating that. So in other words, I do not mind the crumbs. I do not mind what remains. I do not mind what falls from the table. What I am doing is I am eating at the same time. And in the Gospel of Mark, very clearly, it is that the woman has beaten Jesus in the argument. Matthew will not allow anyone to win an argument with Jesus. Mark, of course, very clearly realizes that the woman has bested Jesus. The woman has overcome Jesus. The woman's response is such a powerful response that Jesus cannot say anything else except to say, for saying that. Notice no mention of faith. He does not mention faith at all. Obviously, Mark would want us to understand that the faith is shown in her bowing down before Jesus, falling down at his feet. The faith is shown there in action. But no mention of faith is made at all. And that is very striking. The Markan Jesus very clearly realizes the woman has beaten him in the argument and graciously accepts that defeat. For saying that, you may go. That means you have beaten me in the argument, and the woman goes and she finds that her daughter has been made well. When we look at this text and compare it with the text in Matthew, this is basically what we find. Matthew does not mention the detail about Syrophoenicia. He mentions Canaanite woman, by which he understands that she is a Gentile. The Matthean Jesus very clearly says, it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Notice there is no mention of the children being fed first. In other words, in Matthew, there seems to be no scope at all for the dogs to eat. In Mark, because the children are fed first, there is scope that the dogs can eat later, but not so much in Matthew. The response in Matthew is, even the dogs eat the crumbs, notice, that fall not from the children's table, but the master's table. In Mark, the dogs eat the children's crumbs. So you notice in Matthew, the masters have to throw the crumbs. In Mark, the crumbs are falling even as the children are eating. So the chosen ones in the Gospel of Matthew are the masters. The chosen ones in the Gospel of Mark are the children. And Matthew, of course, because he will not allow anyone to win an argument with Jesus, says, woman, great is your faith. And in Mark, for saying that, you may go, because you have won the argument with me. The next text is once again a healing in a Gentile territory. The return from Tyre and by way of Sidon is mentioned, so to indicate that Jesus is now still in Gentile territory. And he goes to what is known as the region of the Decapolis. The Decapolis, basically the 10 cities mentioned there. Mark's geography is vague. So, but it emphasizes the focus is not so much the geography as the fact that Jesus is still in the Decapolis, still in Gentile territory. And they brought to him a deaf man. Notice there are some who mistakenly think that the man is deaf and dumb. This man is deaf, but he has an impediment in his speech. That means he's not able to speak properly. He's deaf and unable to speak properly. It is obvious that the deafness has affected his speech, because when a person is unable to hear, he's not able to hear the sound, and so he will speak not in the manner in which other people speak, or in which he would have spoken if he could hear. That's why he has an impediment in his speech, but he's not dumb. So once again here, there is a begging. The begging is an indication of great entreaty. What does Jesus do? This is the first of two miracles in which Jesus uses external methods. The taking the man aside in private is interpreted in a variety of ways. And because Jesus is in Gentile territory, it seems the secret of healing is the prime reason. While other reasons are Jesus wants to be alone and focus and concentrate. This is one explanation. Another is about the messianic secret. Of course, later, when Jesus tells them not to tell anyone, the messianic secret is more visible there, not so much here. It could be on the surface level to avoid people who are curious. What is Jesus going to do? So I'll take him away so people cannot come. People get the message. You remain there. I'm going to do what I have to do with this man. But it seems to me that here, because it is Gentile territory and the Hellenistic faith healers would use external methods, incantations, paste and spittle, etc. Because of that, Jesus wants to maintain the secret of the healing. This is why Jesus takes him aside. Because the man is deaf, the fingers are put in his ears, and saliva as was thought to have great healing powers. And so that's why Jesus uses also saliva when he spat and touched his tongue. So it is the ears and the tongue of the man that is affected. The use of this external methods, according to me, very clearly is because Jesus is in Gentile territory. There is a phrase we use that when you are in a particular place, you must behave according to the people of that place so that they will understand you, that they will be able to know you, that they will be able to interpret you in their language, in their terms. And so, because Jesus is in Gentile territory, he uses the methods of Hellenistic or Greek faith healers, which were external methods, like he has done, putting his fingers in the man's ears, spitting and touching his tongue, even though saliva was known to have great healing properties. That is also the reason for spitting and touching his tongue, whereby he could be able to speak properly. However, that is not over. Looking up to heaven is a sign of asking for God's help and crying ephphatha, which is be open. Once again, like Talitha cum, Mark uses the Aramaic word here and translates it into Greek. But the healing is immediate. When we are told once again that he was able to speak plainly, that is, there was no more any impediment. He was able to hear, and the impediment in his speech is removed. And Jesus gives a command to silence once again here, ordered them to tell no one about it. So very clearly, it is a command to silence. And again, we might say, at the beginning of the text, we were told that they brought to him a deaf man. Now, they would surely mean more than two people, even 3 or 4 or 5 people. So, and here once again, Jesus orders them not to tell anyone. Now, them means more than one person. Those people saw Jesus take the man aside because they were the ones who brought him to Jesus. They saw Jesus put his fingers, maybe from afar. Maybe they did not really hear what Jesus was saying. Maybe they did not really see in detail what Jesus was doing. But they know that the man whom they brought was deaf with an impediment in his speech. And they know that now the man can speak plainly and he can hear. So what sense does it make to tell them not to tell anyone? Once again, Mark is telling us, and Mark is bringing to our attention that the messianic secret is that Jesus does not want to be known merely as one who can make the deaf hear and the dumb or those with an impediment in their speech talk. He does not want to be known merely as a healer. Their response is they were astounded, which is in a certain sense natural, that when they bring the person to him, even though they believe, but the astounding beyond measure is also when they see something like this, some mighty work which is done like this, they respond by saying, he has done everything well. He makes the deaf hear and the dumb speak. So in other words, Jesus, as far as they are concerned, is someone who has done everything to perfection.